meditation garden, the return to regular outdoor Kiddush after services, beginning with the first day of Sukkot, and also the schedule for Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. See how quickly the holidays move if you just start talking about them. But we are having a Yizkor again on Shmini Atzeret and a pre-Simchat Torah family barbecue, and we've created a plan for more socially distant, a different kind of Simchat Torah limited dancing, and opening the entire Torah as has been our tradition, which we'll do again in this room and also on the live stream. And it's always a good policy when we have a large gathering to be conscious of the emergency exits in the front, on the side, and in the back of the room. Sometimes we don't know whether to laugh or to cry. An Israeli cartoon from May has a man running towards the bomb shelter with rockets flying all around. As he reaches the entrance, he's stopped by an older gentleman who asks, "Kulanu mechusanim?" Is everyone vaccinated? Some people even express gratitude for the conflict. The rest of the world is continuing its battle with COVID. Thank God we Israelis can return to our normal routines. Unfortunately, we understand just how normal the conflict has become. We understand how normalized an anti-Semitic form of Israel bashing has become. And the only response is the Israeli response. Ein breira. We have no choice. We have no other land. I read a poem of Yehuda Amichai, Israel's poet laureate until his death in 2000, which presents the typical Israeli mindset. Be strong, look macho on the outside, even if on the inside there's reason to fear. Asur leharot chulsha. You mustn't show weakness, and you've got to have a tan. But sometimes I feel like the thin veils of Jewish women who faint at weddings and on Yom Kippur. Hamatzav hu achshav kazeh. This is the way things stand now. If I pull out the stopper after preparing myself a bath, I'm afraid that all of Jerusalem, and with it the whole world, will drain out into the huge darkness. That's a poetic version of the classic Jewish telegram. Start worrying, details to follow. And it feels appropriate for the moment. ADL was already reporting alarming anti-Semitism numbers since at least 2017, and then came the conflict in Gaza. Anti-Semitic incidents more than doubled in May 2021 compared to a year earlier, and not just hurtful posts on social media, also assaults. On May 18th, diners at a Los Angeles restaurant were attacked by individuals in cars carrying Palestinian flags and screaming, "You should be ashamed of yourselves." On May 22nd, a Jewish man in Manhattan wearing a Magen David necklace was punched by a man who allegedly said, "What is that around your neck? Does that make you an effing Zionist?" We've heard of attacks in Boston and Las Vegas and many places in between. And on the college campus, Jewish students being told they cannot join certain clubs to fight domestic abuse or racism if they also espouse pro-Israel views. Or professors saying that Zionist views are unwelcome, or refusing to support students who wish to study in Israel. Or BDS or other referenda that seek to isolate Israel as uniquely illegitimate among the nations. In 2020, the 75th United Nations General Assembly adopted 17 resolutions condemning Israel, and 6 for the rest of the world combined. It's a pattern that has persisted for more than 73 years. In 1975, the Assembly infamously passed its resolution declaring Zionism the belief that the Jewish people has a right to self-determination in its own land, a form of racism and racial discrimination. Now, the resolution was revoked in 1991, but the sentiment persists. It's not just a challenge to government policy. To question the basic right of the Jewish people to self-determination, that's like questioning Shabbat. That's questioning a basic part of my identity as a Jew. That's anti-Semitism. This week marked the 20th anniversary of the infamous Durban Conference. Its stated purpose was to combat racism, but it quickly devolved into a festival of hate against Jews and the Jewish state. American and other Western delegations walked out and have boycotted similar conferences since, including this year, but the damage is done. Now, I understand the complexities of the Middle East. I understand questions about use of force, policies toward non-combatants, the impossibilities of asymmetrical warfare. There are legitimate questions any government, including Israel, must face. Important questions that any lover of Israel must ask. When I returned from a short trip to Israel in June, I raised my own pretty stinging questions about Israel's failures towards its non-Jewish citizens. The riots in Israel's mixed cities in May were not an intifada. These were Jewish and Palestinian citizens facing off against each other, and it was alarming because Israel's Declaration of Independence delineates a sacred responsibility to uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex. Those are legitimate questions. But legitimate questions become anti-Semitic when Jews are targeted or judged collectively for the deeds of a sovereign government. Legitimate questions become anti-Semitic when they're accompanied by stereotypical allegations that Jews control the media or brainwash world leaders to garner support for the Jewish state. Legitimate questions become anti-Semitic when they become a tool to deny the Jewish people of our right to self-determination or otherwise delegitimize Zionism. Legitimate questions become anti-Semitic when they are directed disproportionately at one state, which happens to be the world's only Jewish state. We can distinguish between legitimate political discourse and anti-Semitic hatred, and we must be willing to stand up against the hatred. It isn't always easy. Amichai continues, Bayom ani matziv malkodot lezichronotai, uvalayla ani oved b'mif'alei Bil'am. In the daytime, I lay traps for my memories, and at night, I work in the factories of Bil'am, turning curse into blessing and blessing into curse. Ve'asor laharot chulsha, but you mustn't show weakness. I love that phrase, factories of Bil'am. You may remember Bil'am, the Mesopotamian wizard who was hired by King Balak of Moab to curse the Israelites during their journey through the wilderness. No matter how hard he tried, his curses turned into blessings. Hein am levadad yishkon, there is a people that dwells apart, not reckoned among the nations. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, how beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. That's the factory of Bil'am. Some think it's a curse to dwell apart. Haman said as much. There's one certain people scattered among all the other peoples. Anti-Semites have always singled out Jewish people as uniquely other. They even cited the Kol Nidre prayer we just recited as evidence. How can you trust a Jew when he has the ability to annul his commitments by reciting this Kol Nidre prayer every Yom Kippur? But Bil'am turned that around. Bil'am changed different to distinctive, distinguished. The Torah calls that holiness. You shall be holy. Kedoshim tihiyu, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. What does it mean to be holy? Say the rabbis, Perushim tihiyu, you shall be distinct, set apart, different in the way you celebrate your festive days, in the foods you eat, the clothes you wear. The book of Daniel describes how Daniel and his friends were serving in Nebuchadnezzar's court. They weren't willing to eat the king's food or drink the king's wine because it wasn't kosher. But they aren't chastised for their religious commitments. They're praised for their devotion and faith in trying circumstances. That's holiness, having pride in our distinctiveness, making it a blessing to dwell apart. And that's the foundational principle of Zionism, to work in the factories of Bil'am, a people that has always dwelled apart, a people that has always been singled out, deserves a land where we can thrive. Given the chance, we can make the deserts bloom. We can desalinate seawater. We can innovate and make people's lives better. We can be a nation like any other. After 2,000 years of yearning, we deserve to be a free people in our land and to defend ourselves. The Bible scholar Jacob Milgram suggests that dwelling apart means living securely. That word badad is equivalent to betach. In the wilderness, there were clouds of glory by day, a pillar of fire by night. But in the modern world, we have to defend ourselves. Israelis understand that they cannot rely on any benevolent government or the international community to protect them. There's but one takeaway from the fall of Afghanistan. Nachman Shai, Minister of Diaspora Affairs from the Labor Party, wrote on Twitter last month, Lihiyot chazakim, lo lismoch al ish. To be strong and not to rely on anyone else. The American Congress calls it QME, Qualitative Military Edge, and it's the law. Our nation that dwells apart must have the military means to defend itself from attack, because Jewish history warns time and again that the other nations, nobody else, can be relied on to do it for us. We mustn't show fear. We needn't show fear, because the state of Israel is strong. And the people of Israel, the Jewish people, are strong. When Israel stands isolated in the international community, we must stand with Israel. When adversaries attempt to turn the blessing into a curse by singling out Israel as the source of all the world's evils, from racism to colonialism to authoritarianism, we cannot cower in fear. We must make plans to visit Israel after COVID and find other ways to engage by reaching out to friends and relatives there, reading books and articles, attending lectures and classes, especially with our fantastic shlichah, Netta Asner-Minster, who has decided to stay at B'nai Israel for a nearly unprecedented third year. We must assign Israel its rightful place in our hearts, the spiritual homeland of the Jewish people. And we can invest in Israel. Every year at Kol Nidre, we conduct an appeal for Israel bonds. Because we're not all together this year, we also emailed a virtual pledge card for those who are not here. But for those who are here, I invite you to look in the envelope at your seat. Israel bonds are not tzedakah. That would be giving your money away. Israel bonds are an investment, and a safe investment, and a statement of pride in our Jewish state. Israel bonds are meaningful beyond the actual dollars, which are obviously important, because Israel bonds tell Israel who its friends are. If catastrophe were to strike and other investment avenues were to close, Israel would know where to turn. because of Israel bonds, which makes the ask very easy. If you've never purchased an Israel bond, do it this year. The amount doesn't matter as much because what we really want is to increase the number of purchasers. Of course, if you have purchased Israel bonds before, do it again. Consider it an investment in your very own factory of Bilam, an opportunity to turn the curses of this year, conflict, anti-Semitism, isolation, into a blessing of pride, solidarity, and connection. It's not an accident that B'nai Israel, our Israel-centric congregation, is always a community leader in its support of Israel bonds, because we stand with the nation that stands apart. We will turn the curses into blessings. We will never be afraid. We will wear the Star of David proudly. We will encourage our college-aged children to participate in Jewish life on campus. We will call out anti-Semitism on social media. We will teach Israel, celebrate Israel, travel to Israel, engage with Israel, identify with Israel, because Israel is part of who we are. On this holiest night of the year, I pray for our holy land with lyrics from the Israeli songwriter Ehud Manor. Ein li eretz acheret, I have no other country. Even if my land is burning, just one word in Hebrew pierces my veins and my soul. Even with a painful body, with a hungry heart, this is my home. Kan hu beiti. Gemar chatima tova, may our fate and that of all the people Israel be sealed for good in the book of life. Ushers will be circulating.
Ein li eretz acheret, gam im admati boeret, rak mila b'ivrit choderet, el orka el nishmati, beguf koev, belev raev, kan hu beiti. Lo eshkot ki artsi shinta, et paneha lo avatel azkirla, ve'ishir kan be'ozneha, ad shetivkach et eineha. אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוררת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת, על אורכה אל נשמתי, בגוף קורב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי.
Service will continue. On page 224, the fourth line of the page, continuing our slichot, this first cycle of slichot prayers, the fourth line on page 224, L'chun Ranana.
L'chun Ranana l'Adonai nariya l'tzur yisheinu. נקדמה פניו בתודה בזמירות נריע לו, אשר לא הים והוא עשהו, ויבש את ידן